Welcome to another Three Steps to Startup podcast brought to you by Tech Connect West Virginia, Innova Commercialization Group, and the West Virginia Jobs Investment Trust. This is Jeremy Turner from Epic Mission, where we are guiding the heroes of change, and I'll be your host. This podcast is part of the Three Steps to Startup initiative. The goal of Three Steps is to provide early stage entrepreneurs with critical assistance and structured guidance for innovation commercialization, from ideation to product launch and market entry. Three Steps to Startup is made possible by support from the Appalachian Regional Commission and the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation. Today's podcast is one in this series, in which listeners will have an opportunity to drop in on conversations with industry veterans and subject matter experts who offer deep insights and actionable intelligence to help entrepreneurs launch and grow their ventures. Today, we have Scott Ewing with us for another visit. Scott is the co-founder and primary business analyst in the Appalachian Investors Alliance, or AIA. As we learned in our last podcast, AIA is a nonprofit that facilitates greater access to angel and venture capital for entrepreneurs throughout our region. Scott, welcome back.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's nice to be back.
So Scott, a question came from a client, and I wanted to get your take on it for the purpose of our podcast today. When an entrepreneur pitches for funding, the investors expect to be told how their investment will be put to use to grow the business. But once an entrepreneur has cashed the investor's check, what's to prevent the entrepreneur from using the money they raise for whatever they want?
For instance, giving themselves a hefty pay raise, or buying a cushy new truck, or sponsoring their daughter's softball league. We've seen all that. And despite what the entrepreneur promised was to be their budgeted use of funds.
Well, I suppose the real question is, how much control can investors expect over the ongoing operation of a company once they've put in an investment?
I heard a saying that I liked: money is temporary, control is forever.
Is that meaning once the money is gone, investors lose their say in how the business is run?
That's part of it. But what I tell investors is that while it's easy to get caught up in negotiating the financial terms of an angel or venture funding deal, most times those terms work themselves out, or else the deal just doesn't happen. If either side gets greedy, it doesn't make for a productive relationship. And after investors put money in a company, they're no longer sitting on the opposite side of the table from the entrepreneur, right? They should both be on the same side, wanting what's best for the business. Their interests should be aligned.
But after investors put money in, that money goes toward running the business. In 12 or 18 or 24 months, the entrepreneur will be out raising more cash. Then it'll be, what have you done for me lately, to his or her early investors. Is that right?
Yeah, it could be. Could be. Entrepreneurs can outgrow their early investors in terms of how much capital angel and seed stage funders can put into a growing business. But if the company is doing well, most early investors will want to participate alongside later, bigger rounds of investment, mainly to keep from being badly diluted in their percentage of ownership. So yes, after 12 or 24 months, the original investment capital will be burned through. Money is temporary. But what I mean by control is forever is that after the angel or early VC stops putting new money into the business, it's still important that they have a say in how the business will operate. Important so that they can protect the share of the company that they own. Or in the case of a royalty or revenue share deal, helping to ensure that the company meets its goals and pays back the investment from profitable growth.
For our audience, Scott, what are financial terms versus control terms in a venture deal?
Financial terms are things like the price per share or offering price, also presumed value of the business, or enterprise value it's called. Before the new funding goes in, this is called the pre-money valuation. Makes sense, right? Valuing a startup is a bit of a swag. Some entrepreneurs pay to have a certified business appraisal done and use that to negotiate with investors. Unless the business has significant tangible assets, most angel or early stage venture investors don't really care about that sort of valuation. investors are forward-looking, so they care about how much potential value the business can generate once they've made an investment. We use financial modeling to project future cash flow, especially if a company has some operating history. But with startups, investors often rely on industry comps or comparables from other similar businesses. There are other financial deal terms such as liquidation preference and participation that are important. And if entrepreneurs want to look more into those terms, I recommend they check out Brad Feld and Jason Mendelson's book called Venture Deals.
It is an excellent book, Scott. So what about control terms?
Control terms include restrictions the investors insist on to prevent the entrepreneur or company from doing certain things without shareholder or board of director approval, such as changing the company's operating agreement or issuing new stock or going in debt beyond a certain limit or transferring shares, say, in the event that one of the founders passes away. Investors may not want the founder's widow or widower to suddenly take over running the business.
Right. So have Appalachian Investors Alliance funds ever turned down a deal just because they didn't like the control terms, even if the financial terms were reasonable?
It's probably the number one reason our investors turn down a deal, or at least it's on par with our not liking the company's financials. It's usually not because we disagree with the offering price or because we can't come to terms over valuation. But we see many offerings that are reasonably priced, yet the entrepreneur is unwilling to share any amount of control.
You can hardly blame an entrepreneur. They have a vision. The startup is their quote unquote baby. Why should they give up control over their company to investors who may steer the company wrong or worse, nudge out the entrepreneur?
I won't say that those things don't happen. We hear stories. But it gets back to what I said about after the deal is done, investors and founders need to be on the same side of the table. The very last thing our investors want after putting their money at risk with an entrepreneur is to have the company fail. Once we're in with an entrepreneur, we're highly motivated to see that the business succeeds, which means we want the entrepreneur to be motivated to run their business and succeed. It's painful to remove a CEO or founder from a company, and it's even more painful as an investor to have to intervene in running the operation.
So how do investors and entrepreneurs keep their interests aligned?
A balanced board of directors is one way. For a very small company, maybe one board seat held by the founder, one by an angel investor, and a third by a mutually agreed upon independent director. When the next round of investors comes in, expand to a 5-person board that's 2 seats for common stockholders or founders, 2 for preferred stock investors, and 1 independent. Also, investors can insist on adding non-voting observer seats to the board, which allows investors with smaller ownership positions to keep close to important matters and participate in discussions, even if observers don't get a vote. And again, Jeremy, the book Venture Deals is a really good resource. Or there's plenty on the internet about venture deal control terms.
Scott, let me ask you specifically about entrepreneurs using investors' money to pay themselves or co-founders a salary.
People need to eat. Investors understand that salaries and compensation will be part of the operating costs for a business. So it's more a matter of how much. I can tell you that when I analyze a startup or a small business's financials, right after I look at the company's gross operating and net margins, the very first line item I dig into is employee compensation. And here's my issue. Investors give money to an entrepreneur to grow the business, that is, to acquire customers. The entrepreneur needs to understand that customers are the ones who pay their salaries. If you're an entrepreneur, your compensation can only go up if you're becoming more profitable by growing sales faster than you're adding expenses. And that last bit is important. We see too many entrepreneurs add sales and then add more salespeople or staff or raise salaries so that profitability never increases. Top line growth occurs, but little makes it through to the bottom line. And for equity investors, bottom line profit that adds to owner's equity on the balance sheet is how the investor will eventually get their money back. So we have to see that the entrepreneur is working toward growing balance sheet value, which is another reason for investors insisting on having a say in how the business is operated. We need to protect the profitability of the company.
If the entrepreneur is more concerned about being paid today for their hard work rather than growing owner's equity on the balance sheet and getting a payout someday in the future, is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, entrepreneurs take the risk of starting a business with the hope of doing better for themselves and their families, not in 20 years, but once sales are growing, more in the present. It doesn't seem as though the entrepreneur and investor can really be on the same side of the table on this issue.
When I say that the investors are concerned about protecting the profitability of the company, and that means seeing money in the business flow to the bottom line or net revenue. If you prefer, I'm not suggesting that entrepreneurs can't make a good living prior to one day selling their business. But think about it. When it comes time for an entrepreneur to sell their business, whether it's sooner or later, the odds of finding a buyer improve when owner's equity on the balance sheet isn't zero, or worse, negative. We've seen cases where a small business owner who has used their business for years as something of a personal piggy bank, expensing travel and entertainment to the business, big salary, taking advantage of depreciation, buying non-core assets such as vehicles or investment real estate, draining cash from the business to support lifestyle. We've seen cases where they then discover that there's no buyer for their business when it comes time for them to retire. With negative owner's equity, the truth is it would likely be less expensive for someone to start a similar business from scratch than to acquire the impaired balance sheet and existing liabilities of the company. So when it comes time to sell the business or retire, too many small business entrepreneurs discover they've flown themselves into a box canyon with few or no good options for exiting their otherwise cash flowing business because over time they stripped out equity value. This is a common problem and it's a self-inflicted one, Jeremy.
Well, Scott, getting back to the original question, how much control over the way an entrepreneur manages company finances should an investor expect to have?
Best answer is if you're an entrepreneur and you want to run a business mainly to support your family's lifestyle, don't take investor money. Grow your business over time based on organic revenue. Bootstrap the business, as they say. Really, if you don't want anyone minding your business, don't have investors.
What if bootstrapping isn't an option? And I'm thinking of a startup manufacturing company that needs capital to fund plant and equipment costs or input materials.
Well, if you can arrange to fund capital expenses with debt, I'd recommend the entrepreneur look into that. Debt is usually less expensive in the capital stack for a business than equity. Or if you need to fund a mix of CapEx and operating costs or OpEx, consider mixing debt funding or some form of revenue sharing funding with a smaller amount of equity funding, right? Revenue sharing, which sometimes gets called royalty funding, can be much more agreeable to investors for what I'll term lifestyle type businesses. For one thing, investors get their return off the top line rather than off the bottom line, which means that they'll take a small percentage of gross revenue. Then what the entrepreneur elects to do or pay in salaries or operating expenses isn't the investor's concern, so long as the business stays in business until their investment is paid back.
Well, Scott, like last time, you've gotten us to a point in the discussion where more questions come to mind, such as how do investors decide from an entrepreneur's pitch or application that the entrepreneur will or won't turn out to be more lifestyle focused rather than growth oriented. Most entrepreneurs claim they want to grow their business towards some form of exit or acquisition, but you've made it clear that that's not always true. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time today. Can we pick up this conversation again in another session?
Absolutely. I'd love to go deeper into this topic and share what telltales investors use to warn them when an entrepreneur pitching growth is likely to wind up running their business more like a lifestyle venture, leading most times to a bad end with their investors.
Well then, Scott, it sounds like we will be meeting again soon. Until next time.
Until then.
Well, we have reached the end of this episode of the 3 Steps to Startup podcast, brought to you by Tech Connect West Virginia, Innova Commercialization Group, and the West Virginia Jobs Investment Trust. It's our hope that you, the listener, heard something today that challenged you to think differently and provided you the insights you need to take your venture to the next level. To check out additional episodes of the podcast or to learn more about the 3 Steps to Startup initiative, please visit 3stepstostartup.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we will look forward to being with you next time on the 3 Steps to Startup podcast.